Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast. I'm Greg Knuckles.
I'm Dr. Pack, aka Pack.
And I'm Milo Wolf.
And we have another great episode for all of you today. We're doing another Battle Royale episode. The one we did several episodes back was very well received. The people were clamoring for more arguments, more discord. And so we're gonna run it back. So that is what you have to look forward to. But before that, just our standard plugs here at the top of the episode. So if you enjoy the show, please like, rate, subscribe, and tell all your friends. It really helps us out. If you're interested in hiring a coach to help you with your training and or nutrition, Stronger by Science has an excellent team of coaches that can help you out. You can learn more at strongerbyscience.com/coaching. If you want to purchase supplements from a good source with good prices, none of that proprietary blend bull hockey, and you want to get them at even better prices, you can go over to bulksupplements.com and use code SBSPOD at checkout for an additional 5% off their already low prices. If you want to stay up to date with all of the goings on in the Stronger by Science extended universe, you can check out our Facebook group and subreddit. And in fact, that is where we solicited questions for this Battle Royale episode. So if you're listening to this and you think, damn, I have a really good question that I think they should have covered here, well, if you were in the Facebook group and or subreddit, you would have had a chance to submit it. So check it out at Stronger by Science community on Facebook or reddit.com/r/strongerbyscience. Check out our newsletter where we send you high quality, informative content every couple of weeks, not just spamming you with a bunch of ads. It's really good stuff. You can check that out at strongerbyscience.com/newsletter. And if you have questions that you'd like us to answer on the podcast, the next time we do a Q&A episode, record a voice clip, a minute or less, and email it to podcast@strongerbyscience.com. Let's get into the Battle Royale. So the way this works, if you didn't listen to our first episode of this format, is there will be a topic that we have a very brief debate about. What's the time limit or attempt at a time limit per side of the argument?
We'll set it at 3 minutes.
Yeah, 3 minutes. Okay. So we have theoretically 3 minutes. I'm going to go 30 seconds to a minute long, and it is what it is. But we try to keep it short and snappy. One person argues for the particular statement or position. One person argues against, and then the third person adjudicates who won or who lost. And we talk a little bit about the concept generally, and then on to the next one. So that is how it works. And with that out of the way, let's get right into it. Milo, I believe you're adjudicating the first one, and let's do it.
All right, let me tee the both of you up. The statement is, aggressive fat loss phases are best outside of competitive contexts. Aggressive fat loss within this context means losing more than 1% of your body weight per week. So essentially, the claim that you should be losing weight aggressively at a rate faster than about 1% of body weight per week for fat loss for anyone who's recreationally lifting. The person arguing for this statement will be Greg, and the person arguing against the statement will be Pack. We'll always have the person going pro the statement first. So in this case, Greg, whenever you're ready, you can argue in favor of this statement, and I'll start your timer.
All right. So yeah, I will admit I interpreted this statement a little bit differently than the way you just explained it, Milo. Not necessarily that aggressive fat loss is best for recreational lifters, but just that if someone is going to do aggressive fat loss, is it better that that person be a competitive athlete or not a competitive athlete. So I'll just note that at the top of my answer. But yeah, so in arguing for this statement, which I do think I actually agree with, I think that there is a misconception for people who are just trying to lose weight, that it is always best to lose weight at a slow rate. That's something that's stated as if it's essentially self-evidently true in many parts of the fitness industry. And I do think that there are some advantages to that. But there is some research looking at initial rates of weight loss and likelihood of maintaining weight loss over time. So there was a paper by Knackers from 2010 that we can link in the show notes, the association between rate of initial weight loss and long-term success in obesity treatment to slow and steady win the race. Essentially finding that people who lose weight faster early on in a weight loss phase are more likely to maintain more of that weight loss in an absolute sense over time. You would think that there would be rapid weight regain on the back end. That's not what you tend to see. On average, people did regain weight regardless of their initial rate of weight loss, but it actually wasn't all that different between fast, moderate, and slow rates of weight loss. And the idea is that people who have quite a bit of weight to lose, going ahead and at least early on, dropping weight at a faster rate helps them make more tangible progress towards their goal and might help them maintain motivation to continue on with those lifestyle changes and probably reducing rate of weight loss a little bit after an initial phase. But there are some advantages to rapid rates of weight loss in non-competitive people. With athletes, on the other hand, I do think that it is generally ill-advised for a couple of reasons. One, with athletes, it is much more critical that you preserve lean mass to preserve your performance once you have lost weight. And also, if you look at the research on relative energy deficiency in sport, or RED-S, which any competitive athlete would necessarily be in a state of RED-S to achieve a state of rapid weight loss, you see pretty quick performance declines, but you also see hormonal disruptions, amenorrhea, oligomenorrhea, drops in testosterone levels in men, and along with that, increases in injury rates, especially like tendon issues, a lot of stress fracture issues. And so, you will be in a state of RED-S if you're an athlete trying to achieve a rapid rate of weight loss. And I think that in almost all cases, the risks outweigh the potential benefits of just dropping weight a little bit slower. So, I think that there are large drawbacks for athletes to pursue aggressive rates of weight loss. And with non-athletes, those types of drawbacks aren't nearly as critical and relevant, and there are some unique advantages for people who with quite a bit of weight to lose who are trying to maintain that weight loss long term.
All right, beautiful. Pack, now your statement against aggressive fat loss phases being best outside of competitive contexts.
All right. So I will approach this from the listener's perspective, and I will make the assumption that I'm talking to people who are interested in making solid strength and muscle gains. So although you can lose body weight faster and it's not going to be the end of the world, if you're somebody who has been trying their best in order to maximize muscle mass and strength, but more specifically muscle mass, given some of the current data on low energy availability, and I'm talking about people losing roughly 2% of their body weight per week. So there was a study by Oxfeld et al. From 2023 looking at low energy availability in trained females. The ones that were on an aggressive calorie deficit ended up losing a bunch of fat, but also seeing a decrease in muscle protein synthesis. There was a slight decrease in their resting metabolic rate, but they also lost muscle mass. Additionally, when looking, and we We touched on this on the previous episode. We touched on the meta-analysis and meta-regression by Murphy and Kohler, looking at energy deficiency and how that affects resistance training, gains in lean mass and strength. Greater calorie deficits resulted in, or at least increased the likelihood of things going south as far as your muscle mass goes. So in addition to that, and obviously, Greg, you mentioned some of the literature looking at weight regain over the long term, and the fact that losing more weight at the beginning was positive. But I'd propose that for serious lifters who have spent a ton of time trying to build muscle mass, spending a bit more time dieting while also engaging in progressive resistance training may, in some cases, also lead to some additional gains, assuming that they're not in an extreme deficit, as we just mentioned. So you could be looking at a period of time where you're ensuring, or at least doing your best to ensure, that you're not losing any of the precious muscle mass that you built. At the same time, for some body parts that you may have not trained that hard, especially if you have a bit more body fat on you, you may have the chance to make some gains. And overall, it is an opportunity for somebody to get really familiar with taking things one step at a time. That's mostly me saying it from a coaching perspective, that for some individuals, an aggressive diet, especially for those that have spent a lot of time controlling their intake and mass gaining in a conservative way, going too aggressively may lead to them stopping their diet a bit earlier, or having issues with going off their diet. But again, that's mostly from a coach standpoint. My main argument is that if you've spent a ton of time building muscle mass and you are a natural lifter who's not a genetic freak, taking it slower is likely to help you lose just body fat, or mostly body fat, versus risking your gains. So yeah, that's my forced stance here.
I think that you're supposed to be arguing that competitive lifters should be doing aggressive fat loss. I could be wrong, but that's how I interpreted the statement, because I think we both ended up arguing against that proposition.
Yeah, I think we might have an issue with my statement being too vague. So my statement was essentially that unless you're a competitive athlete,
that's how
you can lose weight aggressively.
Fast. Yeah,
and that's better.
Yeah, that's what
I got. Sense. If you'd like, we can redo this segment, or we can just skip this one and edit it out. It's up to you.
Or leave it as a nice blooper full of knowledge. Yeah,
or you could present it that it's so obvious to both of us that competitive lifters shouldn't be doing aggressive weight loss phases, that we both interpret the statement that way. I don't know. I'll be straight up. So just to make this more useful for the listeners, the arguments for competitive athletes doing aggressive fat loss mostly boil down to you don't want to spend as long of a period of time dieting, so go ahead and cut faster, get the weight off quicker. If you lose some muscle, you got mechanisms of muscle memory, myonuclear domain theory, et cetera, blah, 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 that will allow you to more quickly regain the muscle that you may have lost during the dieting process. Therefore, it's a good thing to do. I don't think those arguments are all that strong. One, because the actual risks associated with rapid weight loss, during the period you're actually losing weight, are real. If it all goes well, cool. If you end up getting hurt during that period of rapid fat loss, well, now you have the period of injury rehab to contend with, and not just the initial cut. And also, the assumption that you're going to be able to rapidly regain the muscle you lose, all of that data comes from training cessation type contexts. The data that we have looking at body comp changes of physique athletes, for instance, after they lose a lot of weight and then their competitive season is done and then they start eating more, you tend to see preferential fat regain before you see a ton of like muscle regain. So I think that the theory that like, oh well, you lose some muscle maybe, but it's all going to come back like immediately. Like that's just not really borne out that well in human data. But yeah, those are the arguments kind of in favor of those rapid weight loss phases. And I'll also note, just as a coach, you don't see good lifters doing it or good athletes in sports. I don't know. Like I spent some time coaching like pretty high level American football players and basketball players who, like most of them by and large, were trying to gain weight. But like the ones that did have some weight to lose, like it's not like, oh, season's coming up, let's try to cut like 20 pounds in a month. Like it was kind of understood that that's not going to be good for anyone. And in powerlifting, yeah, I mean, like if people are trying to drop a weight class, they do that gradually. If people do have like a rapid period of weight change, it's usually like a water cut. But if someone's, 5 kilos over their weight cap, they might lose like half a kilo per week for a couple months and then like a water cut at the end. But like no one, like I legitimately can't think of any high level lifters who have found success doing like really aggressive weight loss into meets or kind of period. I don't know. Like it's not something you see good athletes doing. By and large.
Yeah, I think your stance was still solid for the average lifter. I think you still defended the fact that an aggressive fat loss phase is totally fine for a recreational lifter who wants to lose fat. So then I try to argue against that if you're the average SBS listener and Greg says you should lose weight fast because it's fine, and the literature says that it's not going to impact your weight loss long term, then I try to come up with arguments against that. So I think we covered we battled, and it was Royale as well and Royal as well.
Fair enough. Okay, so Milo, who you got?
Honestly, I think the listener won. The information was good from both sides. I think we covered both the competitive and the recreational aspect pretty well. Initially, more so the recreational side of things, like with Greg saying, hey, you can probably lose weight faster if you're relatively overweight. And from the research, at least, it doesn't seem like that's going to have any long-term negative influences on your weight loss maintenance or anything. And then with Pac saying that, hey, if you are a bit more serious about lifting, potentially don't need to lose as much weight, etc., there might be specific downsides to losing weight too fast, such as muscle loss. And then Greg kind of tying it all up, saying, hey, although some mechanistic and in animal research has found that regaining lost muscle might be easier than gaining in the first place, like quite a bit easier, in practice, you don't often see that bearing out super well. So yeah, I'm going to call this one a tie, if only because there was some confusion around the initial proposition.
On to the next one. So the statement is cheat reps build more muscle than strict reps. Arguing the pro here is Milo, and arguing the anti is Pac. Let's get it.
All right. So I'll be arguing for the statement that cheat reps do in fact build more muscle than strict reps. I think the way to look at this is essentially to look at the relationship between how close to failure you train and hypertrophy. So although evidence is somewhat mixed on this, I do think generally, as evidenced in meta-regression by Robinson and colleagues from 2023, the closer to failure you go, the more hypertrophy you'll see. Now, generally, the way people cheat is that they extend a set by becoming incrementally sloppier as the set goes on. And oftentimes, that will result in people taking sets past failure, even on the local level. So maybe they can't get another strict rep anymore, they extend the set doing cheat reps. And although technically their back isn't, for example, able to get the barbell to touch their chest anymore during the barbell row, for example, by using a bit more momentum, they're still able to train their back, even though it's not able to produce enough force anymore to perform the rep strictly on its own. And so you're essentially performing a quasi-drop set with each set by doing cheat reps. And if you look at the drop set research by Coleman et al., for example, a meta-analysis on the topic, doing only 30% extra sets seems to result in similar hypertrophy using drop sets versus straight sets. And so if each set becomes a quasi-drop set by using cheat technique towards the end of the set and extending the set essentially, that makes each set more effective for hypertrophy, because you're essentially doing a drop set or extending the set with each set when you're cheating. This is important because most people have constrained time. I think most people overestimate how much fatigue is a bottleneck to their gains for hypertrophy, and underestimate how much volume they can and potentially should be doing to maximize hypertrophy. So if we're talking about the average trainee who has, say, a couple hours in the gym a week or 3 hours in the gym a week, who is trying to maximize bang for their buck, how much hypertrophy they get within their constrained time, then doing cheat reps is a way to essentially get more out of each unit of time. It allows them to oftentimes also handle more weight in the stretch, which might potentially be beneficial as well, based on the research on the stretch potentially being more hypertrophic than the peak squeeze. So when you combine the fact that cheat reps allow you to essentially turn each set into a drop set, which is primarily important for time-constrained people, which is most people ultimately. Most people could probably grow more if they did more volume. With the fact that cheat reps often allow you to handle more weight in the stretch position, I think cheat reps might actually allow you to build a bit more size. Importantly, and this is something that I'm sure Pac will touch on as well, as the preeminent researcher on lifting technique, having published the only review paper on lifting technique, there just isn't any research to rely on here. So we're both making a speculative case. But I think my case is stronger. So I'll leave it there.
All right. Wolfgang Girardi, Austrian gymnast who passed away in 2018. Actual name. I appreciate the mental gymnastics there. But I'll pose the argument of strict technique being better than cheat reps for one particular reason. There's an area of research you may be familiar with, the range of motion literature specifically. So I'll say, okay, if we look at the average gym goer and many exercises when cheat reps are used as the main sort of approach, like we look at a bench press or a bicep curl, and alongside, deadlifts, a bunch of stuff. You see the stretch being less emphasized and more either use of momentum, aggressive touch and go being used, and overall a removal of hard training at long muscle lengths. Now, as you mentioned with cheat reps specifically, there are some cases where you may be able to handle more weight at the stretch, but if we're talking about the average individual who's looking to incorporate cheat reps and they're using the information available on cheat reps to sort of guide what cheat reps will look like, I think you end up in a situation where you're neglecting long muscle lengths more than you're emphasizing them. Now, with our personal biases, our version of cheat reps is good reps, just maybe with a tiny bit of momentum towards the end or something along those lines. But if you're approaching training with the mindset that cheat reps are going to build more muscle than strict reps, then I do see a case where people could be emphasizing training at shorter muscle lengths overall on a bunch of exercises, maybe not every single exercise. At the same time, if you're then limiting range of motion and at the same time using heavier and heavier loads, you may also find yourself at a position where you're increasing injury risk, although I'll say that with a huge asterisk next to it, because, we don't really know. But overall, I'll leave it at the fact that I don't see much of a reason to go to use cheat reps just because you may be able to go closer to failure or that you're inherently training closer to failure, because we've seen from the literature that people are relatively good at gauging how close to failure they are. So therefore, if we tell them, look, the best way to build muscle is by keeping things relatively strict, now go close to failure and make sure you're taking the musculature that you are targeting actually close to failure, I think that will suffice. Last but not least, if you're emphasizing cheat reps versus strict reps, you may also find yourself in a position where you're not really fully targeting the muscle that you want to target, and you're taking other muscles to failure, although that's just a minor point. Overall, I don't see a solid reason for why somebody would emphasize cheat reps. Obviously, the odd cheat rep here and there is fine, but I think that strict reps, ticking certain boxes, will build more muscle.
I think I have to give this one to Pack. I think that the statement itself, cheat reps build more muscle than strict reps, is a categorical statement that is unlikely to be true as a categorical statement. I think that both of you did a good job of arguing that there are certain contexts and certain ways of doing cheat reps that may be beneficial and some that may not. And yeah, I think that's a very reasonable take. But I think for the pro side to win this debate, a strong case would have needed to be made that cheat reps are categorically build more muscle. And yeah, that wasn't really a case that was made. I think in part because we're not hacks, and it would be tough to make that case by any of us with a straight face. But yeah, I think both of you did well, but just for kind of structural reasons embedded within the question, I have to give it to Pack.
That's fair. I guess the way I view these statements for me is more so on an average basis. Do I think on average this is true? Obviously, it's very difficult to come up with a statement in lifting that is going to be applicable and true for every single trainee. But yeah, I think if it's interpreted categorically, I can certainly see how that's an impossible argument to win.
Downplaying my victory. Thank you.
Hey, always if you lose, always make up for it somehow. The war's not over.
And who knows? Maybe I see Pack as the adjudicator for the next question, and I'm just trying to butter him up.
All right. So the next question, and this is a good one, not question, but statement is: studies in beginners shouldn't be considered for advanced trainees. We have Milo arguing pro and Greg arguing against. So the floor is lava, and it is yours, Milo.
So at the risk of having Greg call out the fact that this is a categorical statement yet again and losing by default, I'm going to argue that studies in beginners should indeed not be considered for advanced trainees. So there's a few things here. One, we do have evidence suggesting that the adaptations in the first few weeks of training are relatively distinct from how adaptations keep occurring. For instance, just to play devil's advocate here, there is a camp of researchers in looking at the mechanisms of hypertrophy that argue that hypertrophy initially occurs more so longitudinally, and then in the long term occurs more so radially. So essentially via increases in pennation angle, more so addition of sarcomeres in parallel versus in series. And so all that to say that hypertrophy might very well occur differently in beginners versus more advanced trainees. Similarly, practically speaking, just looking at anecdotes and people training in the gym, the same training program applied to a beginner and advanced trainee can have relatively different effects. So, given that an advanced trainee typically carries more muscle mass, has a higher strength level, hypertrophy may occur in different ways just mechanistically on the sort of muscle level. I think that the jump from studies in beginners to studies in advanced trainees can be too large to make happen realistically. And in fact, little spoiler alert, we're currently conducting a study in advanced trainees, and the results may be somewhat divergent from what we see in more beginner trainees. And I think that does sometimes occur, that the results that you see replicated time and time again in newer trainees don't necessarily replicate as well in more advanced trainees. I guess one area of research where that does seem to be true is just the rate of muscle growth observed. Like, it is generally agreed upon that the longer you've been lifting for, the less muscle growth you see, and that does seem to apply to going from beginner trainees to more advanced trainees. And importantly, one thing we, for example, don't know yet is whether or not certain factors become more important as you become more trained. Like, it's relatively rare in a training intervention study in beginners to not observe any muscle growth, even if they're doing quote-unquote relatively suboptimal training, whether that's very low volume training or anything else. But if you then apply that same reasoning to more advanced trainees, and this might be more of a case of absence of evidence versus evidence of absence, there is a chance that that suboptimal training is no longer sufficient to even cause any muscle growth. And so I think just when you consider the difference in approaches practically with the absence of evidence in more advanced trainees and the fact that generally the mechanisms may or may not differ in how hypertrophy occurs, I think there's a case to be made that anecdotes should be relied upon a fair amount and that studies in beginners shouldn't be considered as heavily or potentially very heavily upon for advanced trainees.
All right.
Cool.
I appreciate the arguments that Milo made, and I disagree with his perspective. Not just within the context of this episode, but I do actually disagree with this statement. This starting with an appeal to authority, starting off strong. As someone who's spent a lot of time reading research in this area, I think people would be shocked how frequently initial findings on untrained lifters turn out to generalize to advanced lifters. And oftentimes to the extent that they apparently don't, like some of the examples that Milo provided, it's often a difference of kind of like translation, where like concepts translate even if specifics don't. So the example of training volume, for instance, one thing we do see is that higher training volumes tend to cause more muscle growth in untrained lifters, and higher muscle volumes tend to cause more muscle growth in trained lifters. But in untrained lifters, it might be the difference between 2 sets per week and 5, where 5 is the high volume condition and it leads to more growth than 2. Whereas in trained lifters, it might be the difference between 8 and 20, where 20 causes more than 8. And so you could look at that kind of small picture and say, oh, well, the study in untrained lifters finds that 5 sets per week causes a lot of muscle growth, and that isn't the case in advanced lifters. But conceptually, between the two studies, they both tend to find that higher training volumes lead to more muscle growth. And that's what we generally see in the research on untrained versus well-trained lifters. You do have a lot more wiggle room to make a program effective in untrained lifters, where kind of the meme that like everything works for noobs is like kind of true. But things that work better in like if thing B works better than thing A in untrained lifters, that typically generalizes pretty well to trained lifters as well, where thing B also works better than thing A there, although the actual dosage of the training in order to see that effect may be different or considerably greater. The other point that I would make is that in terms of differences in adaptations to training, and just like big picture physiologically how people respond to training, it is true that for your very first workout or first couple of weeks of training, there are kind of big differences in kind between trained and untrained lifters. Specifically, you tend to see much longer time courses of recovery, way more muscle damage. And there's some research suggesting that those things might influence some of the early rates of adaptations that we see in people, et cetera, et cetera. But a corollary to that is a lot of those differences. And this is seen with like muscle damage and the repeated bout effect. And I think it's theorized to be the case for longitudinal hypertrophy as well. Those adaptations are pretty quick. So if you expose someone to the same training stimulus for like 2, 3, 4 weeks in a row, it seems they adapt to it pretty quickly in terms of mitigating muscle damage and getting getting down to like kind of normal-ish time courses of recovery. And it's theorized that a lot of those longitudinal hypertrophy adaptations, if they occur, are occurring within 2, 3, 4 weeks as well. So if you have a training study that lasts for 12 weeks in untrained lifters, for the last like 8 to 10 weeks of that, there are still differences in degree in terms of how they'll respond to training versus advanced lifters. Like they will still grow faster than advanced lifters will. But those like big differences in kind in terms of like big picture physiologically, what is training doing here, seems to be pretty similar. Like it doesn't take that much training experience for the sort of like post-exercise adaptive window to look pretty similar between folks. New lifters grow faster just because they still have more room to grow. And in fact, there are a lot of situations where it can be preferable to do research on untrained lifters just because they do adapt faster. And so if a particular training intervention or training concept or whatever is in general going to be better for most lifters of all experience levels, and untrained lifters who can grow a lot in the course of 8, 12 weeks, you can have enough growth occurring in both groups that you can have enough divergence in growth responses to actually be able to statistically like detect the difference. Whereas in advanced lifters, you might still see directional differences between two things, but just since less total growth is occurring, any result is going to be quite a bit less clear. Just because like you would either need a way bigger sample size or like a way longer training duration just to generate like big enough effect size differences to have enough statistical power to detect it. So since we do see that findings from untrained tend to generalize conceptually to trained lifters quite well, not only would it be unwise to neglect studies on untrained lifters, like not only would it be unwise to overlook them, it would also just like if there was the expectation that you needed studies on advanced lifters to draw any inferences, you would wind up with a much more impoverished understanding of muscle growth and strength and all of that stuff. And the historical track record finds that early results on untrained lifters do, by and large, the vast majority of the time, translate and apply to trained lifters as well.
Nice. So it's difficult to judge because I have to respect the 6D chess that Milo played here by making you take the against stance and him taking the pro stance. Obviously, we've seen some of the literature on long muscle lengths being criticized for this exact same reason. So he's like, let me appear open-minded here and get the beast, Greg Knuckles, to give us a 3-minute, 10-minute response full of details on why this statement is not true, thereby making myself look good and also winning the war versus the battle. But joking aside, I have to give this to Greg because, like, this is a statement that we often hear, and for the reasons that you just laid out, I think both Milo and I are highly against, and it's one of those annoying sort of knee-jerk reactions you see to studies where they're dismissed alongside the new thing that I have been seeing lately, like, oh, we already know this, we have so much research on this, why are we still doing studies on this particular topic when there's actually no studies? Anyways, all that to say, Milo, my brother, I'm sorry, half a point for the 6D chess and the manipulation, and 1 point to Greg, so there was 1.5 points to be given out here.
You know, I will say that the whole, this is a study on untrained lifters thing, that is, that's a criticism that I almost exclusively see when someone really just wants to say, I disagree with this thing. Because, like, I don't know, I've spent a lot of time observing people online. I've yet to come across someone who has a problem citing a study on untrained lifters in support of a concept that they believe already. Yeah, Yeah, I don't know. It seems like, I don't want to say that it's a criticism that's never brought up in good faith, but it seems like a criticism that is rarely brought up in good faith.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where, like, if you're going to say, nah, like, we can't use this because it's in untrained lifters, I expect you to never cite studies in untrained lifters, and no one does that.
I agree. I think it's on a relatively long list of critiques people throw at studies they don't like typically. And for what it's worth, for the record, I agree almost entirely with what Greg said, and I believe the opposite of what I argued for. Like, all of the arguments I made, I kind of in my head have stronger counter-arguments against. So it was me trying to mental gymnastics my way into believing the statement, and it didn't really work either. So I get why Greg got the win here.
You lost,
Right,
but the audience won once again.
The audience is currently on an undefeated streak. So the next proposition is, an exercise needs to be highly stable to be maximally effective for building muscle. Arguing pro is Pac, and arguing anti is Milo. Take it away.
Yep. So, time to argue pro stability. Now, we all know that stability means a lot of things, because the word is so, full of meaning. Anyways, joking aside, I will argue that going for exercises that are more stable is better for building muscle in the long term, simply because you have less things that you need to focus on, and less demands, less resources used for anything but muscle building. So if you are trying to target a specific muscle and take it close to failure, train it at long muscle lengths, control the eccentric, and all that jazz that we often say, and even the control the eccentric part with an asterisk, I think that creating a stable environment versus going for something more unstable, on principle, should allow you to focus more on the muscle group that you're trying to target and take it much closer to failure in a safe way and in an effective way, versus being limited by the stability factor, which could potentially, throw your bar path off or make the exercise more difficult for other muscles that are working as stabilizers, and therefore not allowing you to fully target the musculature that you're trying to target. However, I do also want to add that by stable exercise, I mean doing your due diligence to make sure that it's as stable as possible, but without that meaning that there can be a tiny bit of instability present. Other than that, I don't have much to say as far as direct literature on the topic. There are some things that somewhat counter what I just said, that I think Dr. Wolf is preparing to cite. So who cares about the literature on untrained individuals? It doesn't apply to us. I'm not a college student that hasn't trained, so I dismiss it, and I think stable exercises are best, and stability is one of those buzzwords that is not a buzzword, and we should really focus on making everything as stable as possible.
All right. I sympathize with Pac for having been given a position that is difficult to argue for. For the audience, quick note, this has all been randomized, so I did not, in fact, put myself into those compromising positions, or Pac, in fact. So I'll put up front, before I start my argument, that we have very little research on this, so it could just be an absence of evidence situation versus an evidence of absence sort of deal. But what little direct evidence we have doesn't really suggest that instability, at least within reasonable amounts, causes any meaningful difference in muscle growth. So we have a study by Satterbakken, not sure how you pronounce it, and colleagues comparing the Smith machine squat to the Smith machine squat on a wobble board to a free weight barbell squat. And in that study, hypertrophy was largely pretty similar between the more unstable and stable conditions. Like, it wasn't a large difference. And with that being one of the only studies we can rely on, and a wobble board being something substantially more unstable than most people would really ever encounter in the gym. Like, I don't know of anyone who's really doing wobble board squats for hypertrophy anyways. Oftentimes you're talking about a stable exercise versus making it a slightly more stable via modification that often requires a lot of modification in the gym. Like, it can take you a while to set up, or it doesn't add much stability. So realistically, within the gym, the exercises being performed, in my opinion, based on literature and based on what I'm seeing, are already sufficiently stable to maximize hypertrophy in all likelihood. Like, very rarely are any really unstable exercises being recommended in the first place. And the evidence also isn't strong enough to really suggest that instability is a huge concern, especially within the constraints or the general comparisons we have in the gym. That I don't think stability is really a criteria to go by when it comes to selecting an exercise. Like, yeah, if an exercise is really unstable, that might present an issue. But for the most part, if you're comparing an exercise like, say, I don't know, a preacher curl and an incline curl, do I think that the difference between those two exercises is stability? And that's why one might cause more hypertrophy than the other. Namely, the preacher curl is a bit more stable or what have you. I don't think that's the case, or at least the evidence isn't there to make that claim strongly. So yeah, I don't think stability in the exercise needs to be highly stable to maximize hypertrophy. I think it just needs to be reasonably stable. And that's a bar that is so low that almost all exercises ever being done in the gym are sufficient to clear that bar. So yeah, that's my my brief stance. But yeah, I just like to note that for many of these things, we have substantially less evidence than most people are aware of.
Yeah, I struggle to choose a winner for this one because I think ultimately you're both right. I do think that the theoretical arguments in favor of stability that Pac brought up are correct, and I think the practical considerations that Milo discussed are also correct. Where, yeah, like if an exercise is too unstable, you're going to be focused on stabilizing the implement more so than working the target muscle. There's not a ton of direct evidence on that, but that does feel intuitively true to me. But I think Milo is 100% correct that within like a normal resistance training context, that isn't much of a consideration. Like one of the best examples I could think of would be like dumbbell bench press versus like machine chest press, where like dumbbells, relatively speaking, very unstable. You know, like you have one in each hand. You don't even have two hands on it like a bar to stabilize it, and there's like infinite degrees of freedom of where each dumbbell could go. So theoretically, considerably less stable. In practice, you do dumbbell press like 5 times and you're like, okay, this is very stable. Like the dumbbells are going exactly where I want them to, you know? And so, yeah, I think that it becomes relevant when you're talking about doing like split squats on a wobble board. But yeah, for most exercises that people would actually be doing, I don't think it's that serious of a consideration. So, yeah, I think I think just because he was given a much easier position to argue, I'm going to give this one to Milo. But I think the key there is just it would hinge on the definition of how one defines highly stable, because within the full gamut of possible stability versus instability, like within that entire range, I think you would put something like a squat or a bench press or a dumbbell curl all on the highly stable end of things, because things can get, you could be on a Bosu ball in the middle of an earthquake, like that's, if you were just looking at like a linear gradation between that as extremely unstable and like machine exercises as extremely stable, there's a large unexplored chasm of extremely unstable stuff, but no one does it because like obviously it's dumb. And yeah, so I think it would hinge on the definition of highly unstable, but within like a normal gym context, I agree with Milo that it probably doesn't make that much of a difference.
So the next one, and I am really, really looking forward to hearing both of your takes, is the statement that optimal doesn't exist. So the optimal approach for strength hypertrophy, for training in general. There's no optimal, we don't know, and we will never know what optimal is. Right, Milo?
Yeah, so I'm arguing in favor of this statement, that optimal doesn't exist. And funnily enough, this is a statement that's often made, and I'll try my best to steelman it in this case. I think the reason people say it, and the reason I can see myself agreeing with it, is that optimal isn't a clearly defined concept. Like, optimal is always in relation to whatever the outcomes of interest are. And because each individual has different outcomes of interest, like, for example, not every individual is interested in maximizing hypertrophy. They may be interested in getting bigger, but not necessarily maximizing it. Or they might have competing goals. There's such a multitude of outcomes of interest to be considered based on individual circumstances that optimal almost loses meaning when you apply it as a generalization. Because there's so much variation in what people want to achieve within the gym and the extent to which maximizing a goal, for example, is important to them versus just getting an improvement. When you add on to this that not only are the outcomes of interest unstable, but rather circumstances surrounding what makes an exercise optimal or a rep range optimal or an approach optimal are also unstable. For instance, different people have different anthropometries. Different people have different reported training histories. For instance, they might claim that they've had better gains with certain approaches versus others. There are so many individual factors to consider that a universal truth, such as the concept of optimality implies, becomes meaningless, or at least meaningless within the context that it's often used. And I think that's what people typically take issue with when it comes to optimal, is that there are so many different things to consider when it comes to the outcomes being pursued, and thus what makes an exercise better or worse, or what makes a rep range better or worse. And there's so many contextual factors to consider when it comes to what might influence or modulate an approach's effectiveness, that optimal becomes an almost entirely meaningless idea, and that therefore optimal practically doesn't exist. I think it's difficult to argue that optimal as a concept doesn't exist, but I think people are generally arguing that optimal practically does not exist. So yeah, I'll leave it at that as my best steel manning of that argument.
Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I actually agree with Milo. I do like actually think that I do think optimal does exist, but I do think that it's one of those things where one, I don't think most people are actually pursuing optimal, even if they say they are. Like it doesn't make much sense unless you are like a professional athlete. And two, I think that it is a moving target to the extent that it does exist, where the idea that like you never wade through the same stream twice because time passes, things change, whatever. That concept applies to training. Like whatever, if you could find the training that was like truly optimal today, you do that training and then your body responds to it in some way, and then that target of what is theoretically optimal will be slightly different for your next workout. And so yeah, I think even if you found optimal once, there's no way you could stay like perfectly over the target. But I am arguing pro here, and I do think that theoretically and practically optimal does exist, which is the statement here. Because for any outcome you're interested in, there is going to be some sort of dose response curve, and they're never linear. Like they're always curvilinear in some way with some sort of like local maxima. And even if it's like pseudo logarithmic, where for one particular outcome you might be interested in, it still seems to like trend up over time. There will be like countervailing forces that would on net begin to make something suboptimal past like a certain stimulus threshold. So like in theory, if muscle protein synthesis kept increasing gradually forever as you added more volume, well, at some point you're going to be extending your recovery timeline so long that it becomes like a certain level of per session volume becomes suboptimal. So I do think you could theoretically define like a local maxima in any of those like dose response curves for any like stimulus and outcome of interest, such that at least like theoretically optimal would exist in kind of all training domains one might be interested in. But I do think you're going to have a hell of a time actually like finding it and staying over the target. But that doesn't negate the, I think, high likelihood that optimal does in fact exist.
Yeah, I'll have to agree with you, Greg, on the last statement. And I think the whole phrase of optimal doesn't exist is often in the same sort of category as the it depends that we often see, and people just like to throw it as a as a way to dismiss approaching training from a okay, what's optimal given the circumstances sort of perspective. So I'll have to give you the win for this one. And although yes, we could argue that we haven't figured out exactly what's optimal, and that may change over time as we update our knowledge and so on and so forth, I do think that there is an optimal approach and there is a suboptimal approach with some asterisks and some terms and conditions when it comes to gaining muscle and strength.
I'd just like to point out that since Greg started his statement by saying he agrees with me, really, I also won. That's all I heard from your adjudication, Hippak.
Yes, that's exactly what I meant. And thank you for your kind donation, Milo. I got the email from PayPal. I appreciate it. So Milo has won, actually. I got confused with who's who. You both have beards. You both have hair. So, yep. Milo gets this one.
I'm going to turn that around, because in Milo's answer, he actually conceded that optimal likely does exist, but it's practically something that most people don't pursue and would be hard to find. And that was what I was agreeing with.
And back to Greg it goes.
The statement didn't specify whether we were talking practically or theoretically, you know? So we argued different statements, I suppose. But I think people are...
That is, once again, a categorical statement. Optimal doesn't exist. That is like the literal denotation of optimal, not practically optimal.
Fair enough. I suppose I can concede that one.
Moving along, indeed. Another favorite statement of ours, I guess. Everyone's different. Experiment and stick with what works for you. Arguing pro is Dr. Greg Knuckles, not a real doctor, not a doctor in any means, and arguing against real doctor, Dr. Milo Wolf.
Yeah. So yes, Dr. Greg Knuckles, Doctor of Love. So I am arguing the pro here, and I do actually agree with this, both within the context of this roundtable and in my real life. I will caveat this a little bit, where I think if someone's completely untrained, they have no experience, they don't know anything, they haven't read anything, I think that this is probably a terrible approach, because their experimentation will be very dumb and poorly directed, and they don't know what they're doing. And I think eventually they would land on something pretty decent, but it's going to take a long time. But I do think that for people who have a bit of training experience, they have done some different styles of training programs and have observed how they respond to it, both in terms of outcomes and just how they feel, like what's going to be something that is feasible and that they'll enjoy doing and get benefits from long term. I do agree broadly with the statement that everyone's different and self-experimentation is a way to find the best style of training for you. Part of that just comes from experience. Like I've been lifting for a long time. I've trained with and around a lot of good lifters. And like the styles of training that people gravitate to can be extremely different. Just like in a powerlifting context, there are people who take like a fairly low volume, like really high intensity approach. And then there are people that do more of like a Shaco-esque death by volume approach. And they tend to lead to, or they can lead to like very similar outcomes. And then you talk to the lifter who does like really high volume training and they're like, yeah, like if I ramp the intensity up, like I get hurt, I don't make progress, it's not good. You talk to the person who does the lower volume, high intensity stuff, they're like, yeah, like I've tried high volume in the past and it just does nothing for me. I just feel beat up, don't make any progress. And that's like obviously anecdotal. But then when we look at the research, there's not as much as I would like, in part because it would require within subject unilateral designs or crossover studies, which have some just like logistical constraints to running them. Like we mostly see parallel group design studies that can't really tell you whether an individual responds better to one style of training or another. But the research that we have employing some of those study designs does hint at some of those things that I was talking about. So there was a 2016 paper by Jones and colleagues called A Genetic-Based Algorithm for Personalized Resistance Training. There would be too much here to really like explain all of the methods because this is supposed to be short. But basically they found people who seemed to be more like endurance-y type folks or more kind of like strength power type folks and trained them accordingly to what they kind of assumed their genotyping was. And they found that the people who had more of like an endurance-y genotype phenotype had better outcomes across the board in like several different tests, including like strength and power tests, than when those same people were trained with like lower volume, higher intensity, higher velocity stuff. And the opposite thing was observed in the other group. The more like strength power genotype folks did poorly when they did like endurance style workouts and vice versa when they did like lower volume, higher intensity stuff. There was a paper by Hammerstrom looking at predictors of whether higher training volumes were going to benefit you. That used a within subject unilateral design. They found that for some people, higher volumes didn't really do much for them. For other people, they did increase hypertrophy outcomes. The discriminating factor seemed to be whether they had an increase in ribosome biogenesis or not. But that's not something you're going to be able to measure for yourself. Practically, you would just experiment. Say, hey, I'm going to ramp up volumes. Am I growing more? Yes or no? There is some evidence that for some people, the answer will be yes. For others, the answer will be no. And then my favorite study in this niche is by Carniero and colleagues, different load intensity transition schemes to avoid plateau and no response in lean body mass in postmenopausal women. This one I particularly liked because it used an experimental manipulation that we know on average produces similar results. So that's high versus low load training, matched number of sets, training to failure. Plenty of evidence showing that on average, higher and lower loads tend to produce similar muscle growth if you do the same number of sets and take them to failure. But this is the only crossover study in that niche that I'm aware of, where they trained people for like 3 months with low intensity training and then switched them to higher intensity training, or 3 months with higher intensity training and then switched them to lower intensity training. And within subject, there were some like enormous differences in gains in lean mass between those two approaches to training, which again, on average within this study produced similar outcomes on a group level. And also we see in a lot of other research on average produces similar outcomes. But, you know, that's something where if you just looked at the research, you'd say, hey, these on average are the same. They're going to be the same for me. But then when we actually see that applied in practice, some of the people did way, way better with higher intensity training. Some did way, way better with lower intensity training. And that does match my observations from being in the gym for a long time. Not only were there just like some outliers for which that applied, where they did like way better with one versus the other. On average, there was like basically no correlation between the gains that people saw with one of those approaches versus the other. So Yeah, that's another thing that you're not going to be able to figure out what sort of intensity zone you respond best to without self-experimentation. So, yeah, it matches my observations, and in the scant amount of research that would help us look at this question, there are lots of hints that like the best style of training for individuals can differ quite a bit, and practically the only way you're going to be able to find that out for yourself is via self-experimentation.
All right. Now, Greg, I appreciate you citing research, and that's cool and all, but I'm going to go the complete opposite direction and cite no studies whatsoever, but more so make a practical argument here. So just as a reminder to the listener, the statement was, everyone's different, experiment and stick with what works for you. There's kind of three parts to that statement. The first one is, everyone's different. Technically, that is true. But by the nature of null distributions in biological attributes, most people do wind up being pretty similar in how they respond to a lot of training variables, or at least they are likely to be. So while the statement that everyone's different does ring true, the degree to which that has a practical impact on your hypertrophy or your strength gains is likely relatively limited, at least for most people. The second part of that statement is to experiment. You can, but that is also practically difficult. So every human eventually passes away. You have finite time to experiment. And to determine cause and effect, and therefore draw inferences as to what works better for you, you would need to test one variable over enough time to even detect a difference. Because you have limited time, that is difficult to impossible to do, at least for every variable out there, to the extent to which it will then improve your results meaningfully, I think. Just because you have finite time, you need a sufficient amount of time and manipulation of the target variable to really even cause a difference oftentimes. That is going to be very, 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 very tricky, practically speaking. The final part of that statement is what works for you. And that essentially comes down to how you measure the outcome of interest. And that gets tricky. There's a reason why in science we need larger samples to be able to detect an average effect, and why we control for as many things as possible, and why we need oftentimes a sample size of, say, 30 to 50, depending on the type of design, or more sometimes, to have any reasonable amount of statistical power and be able to detect an effect reasonably reliably. That is because there's a lot of confounders that can influence the outcomes of interest. So first, let me touch on confounders. Let's assume that you are able to hold all other variables constant that could influence your outcome of interest. Let's say you're looking at your rate of muscle growth, and you are able to do the exact same exercises at the exact same time of day for weeks and weeks on end, the same rep ranges, as close to failure, etc., etc. Let's assume you can do all that for a second, which is already a big jump, a big leap of faith, as I mentioned earlier. You would then need to manipulate only volume. Unfortunately, let's say you're looking at volume. Unfortunately, there's plenty of other things that aren't actually within your control. And so there's confounders that could be playing a much larger role than the variable of interest that you're looking to measure the impact of and see whether or not a certain approach works better than another. Let's say in the first 6-month period that you studied yourself during, you had super low stress, just because life was pretty good, pretty sweet, low stress job, good sleep, etc. But during the second 6-month period, you suddenly had high stress for factors outside of your control. Maybe your podcast co-host started arguing against you in a Battle Royale format. Maybe your girlfriend broke up with you. Either way, there's things that can impact your hypertrophy with much larger impacts than the variable you're attempting to seek or test the impact of. All that to say, given that you have finite time and finite resources, and you're trying to measure the impact of variables that are playing a relatively small role, and there are more confounders that you could possibly really even realistically control for, many of which have a larger impact than the variable you're interested in, I don't think most people can really even assess whether one approach really worked better than another. And certainly not the impact of any single variable, like exercise selection, like repetition range, like frequency, like a given program even, given that a program has so many different parts that make up the whole, that you would be hard-pressed to say, well, Shaco really worked for me because of the frequency. Could it be that you had lower stress? Yes. Could it be that you had better sleep? Absolutely. Could it be that the variations really worked for you? Yes. There's just so many different things that could be causing the outcome of interest that you really don't have high power to detect what works better for you. Second, your method of measurement while practically useful, i.e., am I getting bigger over time, is your outcome of interest. If you feel like you're bigger over time, that's all that really matters in the end, because that's what you care about, right? But that is also likely a measurement method that has a relatively large measurement error and further reduces your ability to tell whether or not something really worked for you. Like, one day I might feel pretty big. The next day, I might feel a bit smaller. I think oftentimes the measurement methods that you have at your disposal practically have a relatively large measurement error. So, all that to say, I think the barriers in place to just do what works for you are just too large to really be practically relevant. And oftentimes, people will end up at a multitude of false positive assumptions about their training and what really worked better for them. I think that, honestly, and this is my most black-pilled take yet as a coach, I think that most people are best off starting somewhere that is on average going to work pretty well. Make small deviations from there based on what their experience is. But I think the process of trying to determine what works for you is almost in futility for the most part, given all of these limitations and all of these barriers. And two, you're typically better off relegating the role of that process, if you're going to use it at all, to be relatively minor, and mostly stick with what seems to work on average pretty well. There's going to be cases where that's not possible. Let's say, for example, you really experience a ton of pain for an exercise, and that instantly restricts your ability to adhere to the other variables that you would like to. But for the most part, when it comes to non-experiential variables, like does higher volume cause more hypertrophy for you? Does 20 sets cause more hypertrophy for you than 18 sets per week? Those sorts of things, I'm inclined to rely more so on the scientific evidence than a very poorly managed attempt at telling what is better for you. Because ultimately, as much as we'd like to, I think we just don't have the means to really ascertain that.
If I can push back against that a little bit, going back to the question, the statement was everyone's different. Experiment and stick with what works for you. It's not necessarily implying that you're testing every little variable and titrating the dose of every single variable to find necessarily like the absolute local maxima of every potential like dose response curve there. It is more generally find what works for you, not necessarily trying to find optimal in every little single variable. And that does open things up quite a bit, because I think a latent assumption in your statement was that you would be testing things that would have relatively small differences, and therefore it would be difficult to like measure and ascertain whether you're actually seeing differences over time. And that's part of what I was getting at with some of the research I cited. Things that on average you would expect to have similar effects, or you would expect differences to be relatively small on a group level, do not infrequently lead to pretty large differences in outcomes on an individual level, to an extent that would be like measurable and easily noticeable over like pretty reasonable time spans. And also, you don't necessarily need to go about setting this up the way you would like an N of one case study in the literature, where you're tweaking little things and you're trying to achieve like marginal statistical significance for every outcome of interest, which would require you to like just tweak one variable at a time and, you know, just like tinker sort of and hope you're heading in the right direction. Practically, like there are sort of archetypes of training, I guess you could say, that have worked for a lot of people over time. And I think that someone could pretty easily train with like one style for 6 months, train with like another like very different style where you're changing a lot of variables for another 6 months, repeat the process a couple more times, and from that get like a pretty good idea of kind of big picture what style of training agrees best with them and leads to generally positive outcomes. And from there, if they want to start like the more minute tinkering process, they could. But I think you can do a reasonable amount of self-experimentation and find the style of training that does work for you pretty well. And yeah, I think that you were thinking. I think you addressed that question as a scientist would, where like if you were trying to set up a study that would pass peer review, and say like for this person, increasing volume 50% affected their gains by this much. Well, how are we going to like define our minimal detectable difference or whatever? Like a lot of that stuff is just out the window when you're dealing with like a practical training situation, I think.
Sure. I'll give a couple points just in rebuttal, and then we can wrap this up, provided Greg is happy with that. So for me, just to point your own sword back at you, I did see this as a categorical statement that, hey, experimenting and sticking with what works for you is always the best approach, because everyone is always different to a meaningful extent, I guess. To me, like, given all the limitations I mentioned, you cannot, most of the time, even if you think you know what works better, you actually don't. The rate of false positive errors in that inference-making process on an individual level is so large that more often than not, I suspect people are misguided and actually end up training less effectively through doing this process, especially when it involves like large adjustments. So you mentioned, for example, comparing two relatively radically different programs over 6-month periods. That is one way of arriving at a conclusion that is going to be more true more often than before, just because you're comparing two very different approaches that encompass multiple variables, etc. Essentially, the impact becomes larger than if you just look at the impact of one variable. The issue with that approach is that, one, it would typically yield a lot of time spent training what is likely to be suboptimal than if you just took what is like a middle-of-the-road approach that is likely to be effective from the get-go. And the other... So it doesn't technically get you closer to what works for you than if you just started with what works for most people on average, is my suspicion there. It also doesn't get you any closer necessarily to understanding what variables specifically you responded better to. And so you still don't really know what works better for you. We have like a very nebulous understanding of it, but I think that understanding is as nebulous or even worse than if you just went off of averages to begin with. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm black-pilled. Maybe Greg is very white-pilled. Maybe we've just been forced to take these stances against our wills. But yeah, that's basically my stance.
The reason I say that like it can be useful to go very different ways, but with sort of like archetypes of programs that have been effective for a lot of people, is that like programs are, I would say, like holistic emergent entities that are that aren't reducible to just the mix of training variables in them in a vacuum, where like for instance, really high intensity programs like dog crap, for instance, where you're training to or past failure on every set. Like they tend to be like lower frequency programs because the people that train like that and find that it works for them do generally find that like, hey, this is producing good results, but like my frequency can't be that high. Whereas if you just looked at those two variables in a vacuum and said, hey, what is like on average the optimal proximity to failure and what is on average the optimal frequency, you wouldn't necessarily arrive at like that same conclusion where you'd say, hey, I'm going to train past failure but like relatively low frequency. Like those are two variables that like don't just exist in a vacuum. They do have like a correspondence to each other, and with like archetypal programming approaches, they do tend to have like a pre-curated set of all of those variables that work synergistically, rather than just kind of like looking to see on average like where each variable in isolation tends to produce optimal results. And I think that I think that can be helpful for narrowing down like a style of training that works well for people. And like I said, just practically, like the high level lifters I know, there are some commonalities in their training, but in a lot of cases, training does look very different. And if you talk to those people, they will say like, yeah, I gave this other like popular style of training that does really well for a lot of people, like a really honest shot. Like I was grinding away at it for like 2 years and didn't get shit out of it. And then I changed things quite a bit and put like 50 pounds on my squat, like and that's what I was getting at with like within an individual, differences in responses for variables that like on average on a group level would produce no or very small differences. Within an individual, it does like differences are often quite a bit larger. Like, trying to avoid the old fallacy of composition.
Yeah, just to respond to that last one, differences that are large on an individual level don't necessarily have to be attributable to the intervention that you gave them. Like, I think, if anything, if you've ever, and Greg, you've done this multiple times, so I'm speaking more so for a listener now, if you ever look at individual data from a study, where you essentially just have the averages reported and you see the average change pre to post, and you look at average changes, if you look at individual changes for individual subjects within that study, it's not uncommon to see much larger or much smaller changes, but those could entirely be measurement error, biological variance, or a number of other things that could be causing the change within one single person. And even when you're describing, say, a powerlifter who's trained for 2 years with one approach and then switched to another and saw better gains, at least a scientist within me is compelled to say that still doesn't really give us much confidence in the fact that one program works categorically better for that individual. It could just be a number of confounders that often have a larger impact on progress than the exact training program. And then, like, as far as inference making capabilities goes, that comparison is also somewhat unhelpful, even for the individual. Like, does that mean that if you've compared Chico to, say, Smolov, and you're like, oh, Chico gave me better gains, the only strong inference, and even not that strong based on what I just said, that you're able to make is, Chico might work better for me than Smolov. But that doesn't really tell you all that much typically, or at least not enough to really, I don't know. I'm just skeptical, I guess. I'll leave it at that, as opposed to rambling over the same points over and over again.
I think this does go back to something we've talked about on the podcast before, where I think the scientist hat and the coach hat need to be a little bit different. Where with like in science, your kind of prime directive is to avoid false positives. Like that's sort of what everything is built around. Whereas in the gym, like the cost of false positives and false negatives are often like equal, like you don't want to overlook something that could give you better results. But you also don't want to get seduced by something that gives you worse results, but you thought it was giving you better results. But those two considerations are like relatively balanced. Whereas in the literature, we don't want to be building a pile of false positives that provides like a shaky foundation for further investigation. And what I would say is that to the extent that false positives exist, in a self-experimentation context, I think what is much more likely is that two things are both generally fine and produce generally good results, and you make the false inference that one is meaningfully better than the other. Because ultimately you're making the inference on, and going back to the question, experiment and find what works. You're not going to try something, go backwards, and come away with like the inference that like, oh yeah, this worked for me, it might be difficult to isolate like the precise variables that did make something work versus not work. But like through that self-experimentation process, you are going to wind up settling on things that did generally produce positive results. And you might wind up with faulty inferences about thing A working better than thing B when thing A and B would both be similarly effective. but you're not settling on thing A if thing A isn't producing positive results.
Yeah, bit of a long one in it, but on that note, what I'll say is I get where both of you are coming from, but I think the idea. So I think most people, when they see this statement and the way they approach it, is they approach it from the get-go, from the initial setup of a training program or a nutritional approach, where they don't say, okay, let me look at what generally works for everyone and then make small adjustments while testing, things like frequency, exercise selection, and so on and so forth, and then see what fits my preference, schedule, and whatever better. But in some cases, the first step is to say, okay, what do I think works best for me based on, assumptions and maybe personal preference from what they've seen, or even things like their gym circle. Like we saw that quite a bit now with the re-emergence of high-intensity training, very low-volume, high-intensity training that was, again, popularized. And you got a lot of people saying, yep, this is what works best for me after trying it for a few months. So although, yes, experimenting with what you may think you're responding to best in the long term is part of having an evidence-based approach to training. There are still some basic things that if you're deviating a lot from, it's likely that you may not be getting the most out of your training. And it's likely that you may think they work best for the wrong reasons, rather because they actually work best. Because if we look specifically at resistance training for muscle growth and strength, I mean, let's just say for muscle growth, for the example, over time, if you are engaging consistently in resistance training, it's likely that you're going to be gaining muscle mass anyways, or you're going to be making some gains. So being able to know whether that was because you did sets of 3 or 5 to 8 reps or 10 to 12 reps or whatever is difficult. So although I do semi-agree with what you said, Greg, I do feel that Milo stance takes the W here overall, but you argued for this from a very you argued for it in the best way possible, and you argued for something slightly different than what the statement was intended to be. If that makes sense, not in a negative way, and actually a very positive way, but usually this statement is thrown in a way to dismiss that we can know what works on average, and that, hey, you can never know what works, man. Like higher reps and a pump far away from failure. Yep, that worked great for me. I saw it. It worked great. It doesn't matter what the science says. Everybody's different. You just need to just do a bunch of stuff and see what sticks. But so, yeah, that's me. I'm sorry. Now I feel bad because you're not smiling. I'll give it to you now. 2 wins for Greg for this one, minus 5 wins for Milo.
No, you can you can give it to Milo. I understand that you want to butter up the next adjudicator. And how's that for a transition?
Game recognized game.
Go.
As the adjudicator for this next topic, the topic is science is just confirming what bodybuilders have known for decades. Arguing for, we have Greg, and arguing against, we have Pac. Greg, floor is yours.
All right. Just a little peek behind the curtain for the listener. This is my second attempt at trying to answer this because I accidentally started by arguing the anti, which is my actual position here. But whatever. Pro. Yeah, let's do this. So I think if you look at the characteristics of effective training that we have, and not just like little details that seem like maybe we can optimize this little thing here or there, but like the big rocks. So, how frequently do you train? How much volume are you doing? How close to failure are you training? Like all of these things. When you look back at the history of the iron game, it's very rare to find successful bodybuilders training in manners that would be considerably far outside what science has now confirmed or supported to be effective training. And it's rare to find styles of training gaining in prominence that again, looking back, we wouldn't now consider to be generally effective training. There have been fads that have come and gone. So there was the high intensity training era where sometimes things did get a little bit wacky, but that was mostly in consumer publications where people were saying, only train a muscle once every 2 weeks or whatever. That's going to be optimal. But when you look at the bodybuilders that were actually successful doing high intensity training, like Mike Mincer, for instance, his overall volume per muscle group and overall training frequency were what we would consider today to be maybe a little bit on the low side, but still within the range of what we would believe to be scientifically optimal. And the same is true of when we look back at people who promoted really high volumes. The classic, was it Haney Rambod? Whatever. The like 8x8 approach to training, doing that a couple times per muscle group per week. That was considered really high volume training at the time. And a lot of sciencey people looked at that and were like, that's too much. The evidence doesn't support this. But in the decades since, there's now more research on higher volume approaches to training, and science has confirmed that, hey, those bodybuilders back in the day, they were onto something. That training is effective, and actually our nerd forefathers in the 80s and 90s that thought that volume was way too high, they in fact were wrong. Similar is true with low volume training, or low intensity training, I mean. So kind of pump sets of 20 or 30 were used by bodybuilders very effectively for a long time during an era when researchers thought, again, that training needed to clear a certain intensity threshold for it to be effective at promoting hypertrophy. It really wasn't until, probably within the last 15 years that data started coming out consistently showing that training with low intensity, like sets of 20, 30 plus, could be just as effective as higher intensity training for promoting muscle growth. These days, like really for the past decade or so, that's just taken as a fact that basically everyone more or less agrees with. But the bodybuilders were well ahead of the researchers on that one as well. They'd been training like that for a long time. They said it worked. The nerds said they were wrong. And it turns out the bodybuilders were right. So, I'm sure when you look back at the history of bodybuilding, there have been a lot of training practices that now we would recognize as suboptimal, or they thought that things would make a positive difference that turns out probably doesn't have much of an effect. But I think if you look at the corpus of accumulated wisdom within the bodybuilding community, you tend to see training practices that research now suggests are quite effective, and in a lot of cases that predated the science confirming their effectiveness by multiple decades.
Cool. So I'll argue against this by saying that although what you just mentioned is true, there are things that have been that the bodybuilders did first and then were confirmed by science later. When it comes to exercise science specifically, so exercise science is still in its somewhat infancy, and it just so happened that the bodybuilders and people engaging in sort of lifting were there before the science, just because it happened to be that way. However, there are many instances. So we had the bodybuilders who, because they didn't have any science to rely on, they were operating on a sort of let's throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks, while also somewhat consuming whatever science was there back in the day. Even Mike Menzer was considered, because he was, not a doctor, a medical doctor. He was like a something in medicine, right?
Medical student, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, so you'd get some bodybuilders and some experts back in the day using whatever little bit of science existed to make big leaps of faith, and then you had a case of let's throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. You see how I avoided the word there? Shit. And but in reality, there's so many things that bodybuilders used to do back in the day and that they swore by that then science actually showed that was wrong. And overall, science is used in order to confirm whether those hunches or those practices that bodybuilders had back in the day actually hold much ground, if any at all. So the idea that, oh yeah, the science is behind because it just so happened that the three things that came out to be true were done by bodybuilders. In some cases, take volume, for example, a bunch of bodybuilders actually, were for the exact opposite of what science showed to be true, while others were pro that. And in the case of lifting specifically, given the fact that we're not talking about rocket science in some cases here, yes, bodybuilders were proven right in the sense that lifting very close to failure is good for muscle growth, or, the couple of things that they said that did indeed turn out to be true. But we have many examples from nutrition all the way to training where bodybuilding practices that were famous back in the day did end up being shown as not that great. And you had people like Phil Heath and a ton of bodybuilders, especially in like the mid-10s, that were pro stimulate, don't annihilate, staying far away from failure, focusing on the pump, avoiding carbs, higher reps for cutting, single sets being the best, going well beyond failure on everything, and doing supersets as a way to actually enhance muscle growth regardless of the time efficiency point, and so on and so forth. So overall, I do not think that the science is just confirming what bodybuilders have known for decades. Science is looking to find the answers behind the why of muscle growth and how to achieve maximum muscle growth and so on and so forth. And it just so happened that bodybuilders were pursuing that before science existed there. So some things will align, but the scientists are not merely trying to confirm what they did. However, bodybuilders and their practical wisdom does have an influence on the science, especially like our research, for example, is very practically driven in the sense that we will try and see, okay, does X, Y, and Z is that actually the case? So yeah, not completely discrediting them, but I do not agree with the statement that science is just confirming what the bodybuilders have known.
If I can just get one more word in before Milo adjudicates this, I actually, in point of fact, agree wholeheartedly with Pac's position. I think that in outside of the context of this stage debate, like my actual beliefs, I think that this perception is not entirely, but is to large extent just kind of an outcome of survivorship bias, where a lot of bodybuilders have trained a lot of different ways and they've said a lot of different stuff, and then science confirms something, and it's very easy to look back and say, oh yeah, like people were saying this in the 60s, people were saying this in the 80s, because there is such an enormous volume and variety of statements made and training approaches that people have done over the years, such that it's virtually guaranteed that whatever science finds now, someone said a while ago. Was it a popular statement at the time? Was it the way that most people were training at the time? Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. But it is a little bit of like survivorship bias, where you can like cherry pick instances of bodybuilders saying things that agree with just about any scientific interpretation, even when people are doing like a piss poor job of interpreting science and just like cherry picking and coming to very like inappropriate and incorrect scientific interpretations. Guess what? There's like quotes from bodybuilders from decades ago to back that shit up too, because you can find bodybuilding approaches or powerlifting approaches or like training approaches to that someone has found success with or someone has promoted to appear to validate just about any way that you want to train. It reminds me a little bit of like people that claim to be like prophets or to see the future or whatnot, like Nostradamus. Like, you make enough predictions,
Respect.
and like
Respect.
some of them are going to be right. Or like a modern example, there's a lot of like a popular meme in certain segments of the internet is like hashtag Alex Jones was right, because like he's had some correct predictions, but the people saying that, I guarantee you, they don't actually listen to InfoWars. Shout out the podcast Knowledge Fight for anyone who just wants to listen to goings on in Alex Jones' world. But like a recent example is he predicted that Joe Biden would drop out of the presidential election on July 20th. He, in fact, dropped out on the 21st, but that's close enough. But when Alex predicted that he'd drop out on the 20th, he said, and the next thing is they're going to nuke Chicago. And like, people might remember the prediction that Joe Biden will drop out on the 20th, but we'll see if the prediction of, and the next thing they'll do is nuke Chicago comes true. I suspect that it won't. But yeah, I don't think that like fully explains it. I do think that a lot of just like collective experience with lifting has led a lot of like gym wisdom to converge on training approaches that are like pretty good. But I do think that the understanding that, you know, bodybuilders have like known all of this and it was like super well understood and blah, blah, blah for decades. I do think a lot of that is just kind of like cherry picking, because there's so many things you could use to say like, oh, bodybuilders have always believed this, or bodybuilders have always not believed this. Like you could support anything just because the corpus that you can draw from is so great.
That was cool that you used the prophet or whatever Nostradamus analogy. I wanted to use something similar, but I was like, I'm not sure if because I was thinking of a Bulgarian blind lady who was predicting stuff. Baba Vagna, shout out Emil, shout out Todor. But turns out she was working with like the Soviet Union intelligence agency. so she was actually like evidence based when it came to her predictions. But yeah, Nostradamus or whatever, as you said. But imagine the nuke Chicago. I'll say it will happen just so we're covered as a podcast and they don't call us like the fake news podcast. So Chicago people, please make your way out. And yeah, hope you're safe.
All right, as the adjudicator, you both win because Greg jumped ship at the last minute,
Yes.
and therefore you both win. I will say the statement was a bit rigged against the person arguing for it, because science is just confirming what bodybuilders have known for decades, implies that is literally all science is doing, and that bodybuilders have known everything science has come up with, quote unquote, and that is very difficult to substantiate as a claim. So Greg, you win this one. Pac, by extension, you win this one.
Yeah.
And yeah,
I do think that a key word there is just known, because like, yeah, that does imply that what science is finding now were like previously like monolithic beliefs. Like people, it's not just that like you could find people saying these things, but like bodybuilders knew this stuff. It was like, you know, kind of established, and yeah, like not just like these ideas were floating around, but like this was knowledge, like treated as knowledge within the community. And like, yeah, I think that that's getting like way out over your skis. I don't think you can really back that up.
all right. I think that wraps up all of the statements and debates we had come up with, but there are a couple of user-submitted takes, or rather listener-submitted takes. And specifically, we've picked one from Facebook and one from Reddit to argue for and against. So, Greg, I believe you're the adjudicator on the first one from Facebook.
Yes, sir. So Andre Bilbrow says, The pump is a useful guide when auto-regulating training. Arguing the pro here is Pac, and the anti is Milo.
Oh boy. Yeah, so when auto-regulating training, so I assume what the user means is that when you're getting a pump, when you're not getting a pump, then you are adjusting based on that, or you're adjusting based on the pump, which I guess is a bit of a tricky one. So to argue pro, now when it comes to the mechanisms of hypertrophy and metabolic stress, although we don't know a whole lot, there is a chance out there that the pump does indeed play a role in some shape or form in muscle growth. Now, without that meaning it is the most important thing ever, but hey. However, F that. We're going to go creative on this one. Arnold Schwarzenegger. Okay, Greg? I don't see any Olympia trophies there. I don't see pumping iron. Last I checked, you weren't the governor of California. And you don't have such a cool last name. So he said that the pump is like ejaculating. And if you are not having this godly feeling in the gym multiple times a week, when you could by making adjustments to your training is arguably much less enjoyable, and therefore you're less likely to adhere to it, and therefore you're going to make less gains, and therefore not getting a pump is killing your gains. You got scienced. So that will be my stance, just to switch it up a bit here, and let's see what you bring to the table. I think that people are with me on this one.
I like how we switched from mental gymnastics to parkour with the leaps of faith now.
Yeah, and I also addressed
string of
Greg.
Force.
I addressed Greg instead of you. My bad. Sorry, I meant Milo. Where your Olympia titles? Sorry, Greg. You got some of the strays there. You were the referee trying to stop us. I was throwing punches left and right. A couple of hit you. My bad.
It's all good. It's all good.
All right. Let me take the loser stance of actually looking at the research. People often make the claim that the pump is related to muscle hypertrophy, and there's a few layers to untangle there, I would say. The first is, what evidence do we have for the pump being predictive of muscle growth? Right? We can argue at length, and we'll probably do so in an upcoming article about the role of muscle swelling for hypertrophy. But practically speaking, do we have a strong indication that the degree to which you experience a pump during a workout is predictive of hypertrophy? And the answer is kind of. Specifically, we have two studies by Hirono and colleagues and by Oda and colleagues looking at the effect of a workout on muscle swelling as measured by ultrasound, and then repeating that workout for a period of 6 to 10 weeks and seeing whether or not the amount of swelling experienced during that first workout is then associated meaningfully with the amount of hypertrophy seen from those 6 to 10 weeks of training with that exercise with the same protocol. And in both of those studies, they did observe a significant correlation, ranging from about 0.4 to about 0.7, if I recall correctly, depending on the muscle group being looked at. Which does suggest that all else being equal, you experiencing a pump probably means something with regards to you experiencing hypertrophy. But there's a few assumptions baked into that lead me to think that the pump is not a good way to auto-regulate training, because we have better options out there to guide our training decisions. One, in these studies, they didn't ask people how much of a pump they felt. They measured muscle swelling via ultrasound. Essentially, they measured the thickness of the muscles being trained before the workout and after the workout and saw how much of an increase there was. Now, that is very different from asking someone, hey, how pumped do your insert muscles feel right now? Because until we have evidence confirming that the two are reasonably equivalent, in that they both are, and that your rating of your pump is actually closely related to how much of a muscle swelling response there is, until we have that, you're making one big leap of faith. There's a good chance that your experience of the pump is impacted by a variety of things, and thus your perception of pump isn't perfectly predictive of how much muscle swelling there actually is, and therefore how predictive of hypertrophy your perception of the pump is, remains quite questionable at this point. Why is that important? Well, for one, even when you measure muscle swelling, the correlation's not super strong. So at the very least, you can't argue that the pump is the only thing you should go by. And I think relatively few people are making that claim, but it's worth pointing out that the correlation's only between around 0.4 to 0.7. So even if you were to rely on the pump, it wouldn't always predict hypertrophy all that well. The second thing is, I think, and this goes back to our earlier discussion, there are simply much better things to rely upon to make training decisions, or at least at the get-go. So when I first establish a training program, it'll generally be in consideration of two things. One, what the evidence on the topic says seems to be quite effective for hypertrophy, and two, individual factors. From there, you can certainly auto-regulate, but I don't think the pump is the most effective way to go about it. Specifically, when it comes to hypertrophy, for example, which I'm assuming this is what it's in context of, things like your recovery, which can be gauged more simply via your performance week to week, are going to be a better way, I think, to auto-regulate, because if you can recover pretty well week to week, and you're doing relatively moderate volumes, and you have the time to do more, you should probably do more volume, as the evidence out there generally suggests that up to maybe 20 to 30 sets per week per muscle, you probably see more hypertrophy. Importantly, I also think that with only 2 studies linking the pump to hypertrophy, and by the way, again, that's the pump measured by ultrasound. You are not an ultrasound machine, so that is one limitation. But with this only being 2 studies, I do think there is the room for a lot of making mistakes when relying on the pump. For example, I get my best pump after around 2 to 3 sets for a muscle. And this is an example, and I think it's somewhat illustrative of a broader point. If I get my best pump after 2 to 3 sets for a muscle, does that mean that by relying on the pump, I should stop my workout for that muscle there? I personally don't think so. I think the evidence directly looking at volume and hypertrophy is a far stronger rationale for guiding how many sets I should do than the pump, with there being only 2 studies linking muscle swelling to hypertrophy. All that to say, I think the evidence is premature, well, rather, the decision to use the pump to guide training is premature given the evidence, and there's a number of sort of assumptions that remain to be verified. And until they are, I think there are better things to rely upon, read the empirical evidence, and looking at performance as a proxy for recovery. So yeah, that is essentially it. And so I don't think the pump is a useful guide on auto-regulating training currently, or at least it's not one of the ones I would look to personally.
Yeah, I gotta give it to Milo on this one. And that is not due to a lack of verbal pugilistic skills on Pac's part. But I just think Milo easily had the more easily defensible position here. Yeah, to make a strong case for, it sure would be nice to have some actual direct positive confirmatory evidence that it's a useful predictor, and that doesn't exist. So if this is at all an evidence-based podcast, the statement wasn't a negative. It wasn't the pump is not a useful guide when auto-regulating training. For that, you would, in fact, need evidence of absence. But since the statement was phrased positively, it is a positive predictor. In absence of evidence is sufficient to say, yeah, we don't have evidence. We don't have strong reason to believe that it is a useful guide. So, I give it to Milo because that was the position that was always going to win, I think.
I took offense when Milo said that we're not an ultrasound, because last I checked, I was. But that aside, we have a review coming up looking at acute proxies that could potentially predict muscle hypertrophy. Fun fact, in the works, pre-printed in the next few months or so.
Nice.
So the listener doesn't think we're just joking around here.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, you can just like put your mouth around someone's muscle and like yell and put your tongue on it and kind of gauge how long it takes for the vibrations to come back. Like, you can, I mean, I don't know if you can, but like, I have a lot of experience doing that, so I'm I'm quite good at assessing muscle thickness via sound waves, but it takes some getting used to. It's an advanced scientific technique.
That would be an awesome video. That would be an awesome YouTube prank video where you go in a gym dressed as a scientist and you actually like ask people if you could touch their bicep with your tongue, and you go like, "Yep, great, really good."
Do you remember? I don't know if this made it across the pond, but there was a kid who was like on TV in the US, God, maybe 15, 20 years ago. It was a good while ago at this point. But it was someone who was born blind and had learned to do echolocation. Like he'd kind of like click and could roughly tell his surroundings from that, sort of like a bat. I've done no follow up on this. I think it was legit. I think it was like Dateline or 2020, some like legitimate news broadcast. It wasn't just on like a conspiracy theory YouTube channel or something. But yeah, like if that's legit, maybe it is possible that humans could be an ultrasound. But I think, yeah, practically most of us not at this time. Okay, on to the last topic for this episode.
So, Needlezor from Reddit says the overhead press is the one true show of pressing strength, and the bench should be relegated to accessory work. I mean, that's just a fact, so we can skip it. And on to the Q&A. Just kidding. All right, arguing pro is Greg, and arguing against is Milo. Greg, the floor is yours.
Sure. Yeah. So this one is like pretty self-evidently true. There's a sport called strongman, and they have a show called World's Strongest Man. So you would think that the one true show of pressing strength would be included in this competition for it to credibly call itself World's Strongest Man. And guess what? There's an overhead event every year. Sometimes it's a stricter press, sometimes it's for reps, sometimes it's log, sometimes it's axle, but you're always putting something over your head. I think there may have been like one bench pressy type event back in like the 80s, like during the Kazmaier era, potentially, but it's not a mainstay. And yeah. So that's piece of evidence number one. Number two, going a level deeper, who is the greatest strongman of all time? There's only one answer to this question. I'm sure people listening who started paying attention to strength sports within the last 5 to 7 years will be like, oh, it's Brian Shaw. Oh, it's Eddie Hall. Oh, it's Thor. And I would just say you're children. You have no sense of history of the sport. The clear answer is Big Z, Zydrunas Savickas. And there's really no debate that anyone else should be in that conversation. He's won the most international shows. Like he has 80 international wins. Second place is Mariusz Pudzianowski with 43. Between the two most prestigious shows, World's Strongest Man and the Arnold Classic, Big Z has like a total of 15 wins. Second place is Brian Shaw with 7. Like it's Big Z all the way. And what was his best type of event? Overhead. He held the log record for a while, although that may have been Mike Bibby. I don't remember that for sure. He definitely held the axle record. And yeah, if Big Z was in a show and there was an overhead event, he was going to win it almost all the time. So not only does the World's Strongest Man compete on the overhead press, but not the bench, also, the best strongman was particularly dominant on overhead press. And how do most strongmen train bench if they do? As an accessory lift. Exactly. Just like the statement implies. So it's clear, overhead, true show of pressing strength, bench should be relegated to accessory work. And like a slightly more serious argument, I guess. You can't really I do think people get a little too bent out of shape about people taking really wide grips on the bench and a big arch. I think in these situations where that does like dramatically influence how much someone can bench, it's mostly lightweight lifters who are like hyper flexible. I think for middleweights and above, if you try to do that, your arms are still just long enough that you have a decent bench stroke. And even if you bench flat back, maybe it takes some weight off the bar, but whatever. Like, it's still fairly representative. But there's none of that with the overhead press. Like, people can freak out about leaning back or whatnot, but the bar is still starting on your chest, and you do finish with it all the way overhead. It is like a more standardized range of motion. You can't cut quite as much. And so, yeah, I think I do unironically think that it's a better demonstration of pure pressing strength. And there's also the meme answer about strongman and Big Z. So that is the pro case.
Right. Time to argue for something I don't believe or against something I do believe. So you mentioned the bench being easy to cheat and people having grievances about that. Well, what you might not know, or Greg, you do know, but the listener might not, is that the overhead press was actually removed from Olympic weightlifting as a sport because of how difficult it was to judge technique on it. So people complaining about a variance in bench press technique making the lift easier, just so you know, the overhead press, or rather the clean and press, was removed from the sport of Olympic weightlifting because of how difficult it became to judge appropriate technique on the press. And if anything, I actually think it's probably easier to cheat an overhead press than it is to cheat a bench for a lot of people. We've all been there, trying to overhead press 2 plates or what have you, using a bit of leg drive. You know, is it cheating? Probably. Can you hide it? Probably can. And that's probably what led in large part to the clean and press being removed from the weightlifting games. So that's one argument. Then if you look at strength, what is strength defined as? Strength is defined as the quality or state of being physically strong. In my opinion, that kind of refers to the whole body, right? Like, I think for a lift to represent true strength, it would need to be sufficiently representative of the whole body. You can argue that the overhead press involves your core musculature and your legs to an extent. I think their involvement is relatively minimal. And if you just look at the primary movers of the overhead press versus the bench press, I think the bench press involves a greater total amount of musculature, with the pecs being more heavily involved. Greg is making a face. I believe we have a disagreement. Greg, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, my counter argument to that is get good at both and come back and tell me. Yeah, I mean, technically you are tensing your whole body for a bench press, but yeah, I mean, like, even just like upper back and like shoulder girdle musculature involved in like stabilizing the overhead press, it's no contest.
Counterpoint. It's been claimed that lat pull downs help you bench more. So clearly the back is involved.
You have an article about that, Greg?
I do.
Snap.
And yeah, no. I mean, come on. Neither of us believe this. The other thing I was going to say is you were noting about judging characteristics. The question doesn't say the strict overhead press, so that encompasses a larger variety of things, all of which start with bar on your chest. Got to get it all the way overhead.
All right, then let's talk about the decline bench press, where you can lift substantially more than the overhead press. And really, how strong you are is defined entirely by how much weight is on that bar. So really, which lift truly exemplifies strength? The decline bench press. Slap on as many plates as you can and you're strong.
I think it's the shirted 5 board press.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Especially for those that don't know, you show up in a commercial gym with 5 dudes all weighing above 400 pounds, helping you get in the thing. You're bending bars. You're getting severely injured and getting carried out in a stretcher. It's absolute scenes. Nobody's going to doubt that you're a strong man or woman.
I will say, like, I do love shirted bench. Like, I've never done it, but just like as a spectator sport, I think multiply lifting looks silly on video. Like when I watch meat clips of like new records, I'm like, it aesthetically looks a little silly. But when you are in the same room as someone doing like a 1,200 pound equipped squat or like 1,000 pound equipped bench, it is like, one, just the size of the weights on the bar compared to the human is just like holy shit, it's crazy. You can like see even on like the thick power bars, like the really like rapid isolation or oscillations compared to like the amount of weight on the bar, and they have to control it and move it. Even with the addition of equipment, it's fucking crazy. And like just it is like a life or death situation. Like there is tension in the air that you can cut with a knife. So it is. I do think like a kind of silly sport, but also it is one of those things that is like incredibly impressive in person, but not as impressive as Serge Redding strict pressing 500 pounds and doing it clean, and Alexeyev, that dirty cheater, going back to it being difficult to judge, absolutely used some leg drive, absolutely unlocked his knees. That should not have counted. Serge Redding, strict press goat for all time, and I will take that to my grave.
And also Milo Wolf and Pack, strict pressing 225. Strict.
That's
very
solid.
strict.
Hell yeah.
How about you, Greg? What's your best OHP?
275.
275. Yeah, but on PEDs clearly. So thanks.
Nice try.
Nice try. Yeah.
Not anymore. That was a while ago, but
125. That's crazy. That's solid.
Yeah.
Minus 230.
I always wanted to get 315, but I've got a jank shoulder. Just it's a long story, but whatever. But that's when it made it clear to me that like this is enough. This is enough. I said, okay, that's fine. I can live with that.
Awesome.
Pack, the suspense is killing me. Who won?
That's true. I'll give it to Greg because I love overhead press, and I stopped listening when you started talking because I'm so biased for the overhead press. I don't do any benching. It's the greatest exercise known to mankind. So, Greg Nuggles, ladies and gentlemen, the winner of this.
I think spiritually Big Z won. We can count this as his 81st major title.
We saw Big Z in Sheffield, last Sheffield, and he's still pretty big, and Z as well.
God, he's such a monster. I do think it's unfortunate that he was on his decline right when like Instagram and like visual social media was like really starting to take off. I think I mean also he doesn't give that many interviews. He never really seemed that interested in trying to become like famous or whatever. And I do think it's a bummer because all of the kids on the internet who have like really, really like hard positions on one of like the not even like modern strongmen. Like I don't even see that many people talking about like the Stoltman brothers, for instance. I think in part because they're a bit less media savvy than like Thor or Eddie Hall were, but they're like not even to be like that much of like an old head, because Big Z's best year was probably like 2014, and that wasn't that long ago. But yeah, man, he was incredible. He was incredible. All right, so I think that does it for this second Stronger by Science Battle Royale episode. I think it went well again. At least I had fun recording it. I hope all of you out there listening did as well. If you did, if you didn't, join the Facebook group and or subreddit. Let us know. And the next time we do a Battle Royale or a Q&A episode, you can join in the fun there. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you again in another fortnight. And until then, stay big, stay strong. Enjoy your overhead pressing. Enjoy reading studies on beginners and assuming that they probably generalize fairly well to people with more experience. keep doing your stable exercises for building muscle with the understanding that encompasses most normal exercises that people would do. All of that good stuff. And until then, we'll talk to you soon. All right. Bye.
Peace.
Peace.